in this next lesson, we're going to be talking about the epistemology of the endocannabinoid system. And some of our learning outcomes are, we'll just kind of get an early understanding of the endocannabinoid system, how it was discovered. We'll explore a bit of the timeline of the kind of key discoveries along the way. And then we'll just kind of look at areas where the endocannabinoid research into the endocannabinoid system really could lead to some breakthroughs in the future. So the endocannabinoid system is actually a very ancient physiological system within both the human body and all vertebrates. It's actually found in quite primitive organisms dating back some 500 million, some are even saying 600 million years ago. So, and in those ancient creatures where they found cannabinoid receptors, that system really hasn't changed much in all of those hundreds of millions of years, which is kind of fascinating. It's a little bit fascinating too that we didn't actually discover or understand that our body has an endocannabinoid system until, about 30 years ago, back in the 1990s or, 1980s. So it's relatively new discovery for part of human physiology, but it's been around and a part of us for, since time began almost, right? Since we started having creatures on this earth. So amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, reptiles, they all produce endocannabinoids. It seems to be like insects are kind of the only thing that doesn't. So when the evolutionary split happened between insects and all the other animals, we're the ones that got the endocannabinoid system, and insects are kind of the only creatures that don't seem to have that. So super interesting part of our physiology that's really just been ignored for a few hundred years. So let's look at this timeline. This is the ECS, or the endocannabinoid system discovery timeline. And you see just some key ones along here. Now, if you remember back to our history lesson, we were talking about how it was back in the 60s when Raphael Mechoulam really started to kind of discover that, hey, there's something going on in the body that we haven't looked at before. And so we'll fast forward on this timeline up to when that first cannabinoid receptor was discovered in the body in 1988. And then we'll go through a few more highlights. So let's look at those. So the first phytocannabinoid, as we know, was actually discovered in the 1940s, and THC, then Raphael Mechoulam took over that, and THC was discovered in the 1964. So, but then, even then, we didn't really understand, well, what does this mean? Is this, is this why people get high when they use cannabis, they smoke cannabis? Or, what physiological process is happening within the body. So there has to be some sort of receptors, or it triggers something happening in the body. And that study of the endocannabinoid system kind of led to what's going on in the body that this plant is triggering when it gets taken into the body. So that first cannabinoid receptor was discovered in the early 1980s. And finding that first receptor where these plant cannabinoids kind of triggered or hooked onto was really the beginning of going like, hey, there's something here, we should look more into this. And so we're still learning about the importance of the endocannabinoid system physiologically, what it does to both our mental, emotional, and our physical being. And we'll learn a lot more about that as we go along. So we talked about that first receptor back in 1988. Dr. Mechoulam had been kind of working on this since the 60s. And once they realized that these receptors were triggered by the cannabis plant, they decided to call them the cannabinoid receptors. So that's really named right after the cannabis plant itself. And as we talked about, this really led into that discovery that not only do we have receptors in our body that that can be triggered by a plant, but we also have those chemical signals that are similar to what's in the plant, our body actually creates those ourselves, right? So those are our endocannabinoids. We'll learn more about those as we go through. But the first endogenous, so endogenous means within the body or created by the body itself. So that's why they're called endocannabinoids, endo short for endogenous. So the research really led to this discovery is like, hey, our body's making these chemicals that we also find in the plant. So what's up with that? Like, what's going on there? The first endogenous cannabinoid that was discovered, they named it anandamide because it most closely mimicked the actions that THC has, which is kind of bringing that calming blissfulness that happens to the body when you use a higher THC plant. So they called it anandamide, which is a Sanskrit word that means bliss, because we actually create this cannabinoid, anandamide, and it does bring a very calming, relaxing feeling to the body. So moving on from 1988 to 1992, 1993, 1995, after the discovery of anandamide, we discovered a second receptor in the body, and they aptly named it cannabinoid receptor 2. So CB2, cannabinoid receptor 2. And that was quickly followed the next year. It's like, hey, if we have this second receptor that accepts cannabinoids from the cannabis plant, I wonder if the body's actually creating a cannabinoid-like chemical that hits on this CB2 or this cannabinoid receptor 2. And sure enough, there was. It's called 2AG, 2-arachidonyl glycerol. We'll talk more about that in another module coming up. But so now we have cannabinoid receptor 1 and anandamide that kind of hits on that. We have cannabinoid receptor 2 and 2AG or 2-arachidonyl glycerol that hits on that one. And so they're starting to say, hey, there seems to be, I wonder if these receptors and the body's ability to create these cannabinoids makes up some sort of system within the body. And sure enough, as more research went on, it became much more obvious because our body actually creates enzymes that either create or degrade the cannabinoids within our body. So in the same way that our body will create hormones, those kind of like any kind of neurotransmitter signaling molecules that the body actually creates itself, it's usually created and often degraded on demand. So a lot of times our body will create these chemicals really quickly, they do the job that they're supposed to do, and then the body sort of cancels them out or degrades them, recycles that material for the next time we need that. And it seems that the cannabinoid system is very similar. So two enzymes that are quite important to the endocannabinoid system, and we'll probably discover more as we go on. But the first one is FAAH and then MAGL. And these are the ones that are responsible for either stopping those cannabinoids that the body creates, either prolonging how long they last in the body or stopping them, shutting them down. And those will create different moods or different actions within the body. We'll get into a lot more detail in another module of this. So once they discovered these enzymes, then they started looking, well, how are these enzymes, where are they created, and how do they trigger the body to create these cannabinoids for the jobs that cannabinoids do in the body. And they discovered that instead of how normal nervous system signaling works, which is they go from the presynapse to the postsynapse, and then something happens in between, what the cannabinoid receptors do is the actual signal to create it comes from the postsynaptic, and that gets that signal gets sent to the presynaptic neuron. And so they call that retrograde signaling. So it works a little bit differently, and all of these clues are kind of being put together and saying, hey, we got some kind of grand physiological system in here that might just be some sort of a master system for all of our neurotransmitter or brain signaling that happens within the body. One of the more interesting ones that made a lot more doctors and researchers start to pay attention to the cannabis plant is a theory that was proposed by Dr. Ethan Russo back in 2004. He had been observing in his patients that, and in his research that he was doing, he'd been observing that there was a lot of kind of related symptoms that he ended up calling the clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. Sometimes it's called endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. I think they kind of landed on the name clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. It's not a proven health condition at this point, but there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that if our endocannabinoid system isn't working or isn't functioning properly, we can have a deficiency of cannabinoids. Our body doesn't create enough cannabinoids to keep us in good health and well-being. So, I mean, we can think of that. We have deficiencies, or sometimes when disease start to take hold, we can have deficiencies in, say, our cardiovascular system or our respiratory system, or how our kidneys work, right? We can have deficiencies in all those areas. So it's not far-fetched to think that if our body doesn't create enough of these cannabinoids or endocannabinoids, then we're going to have a deficiency from them. It's been linked to several health conditions, and I'm sure we're going to see as time goes on and we get more people using cannabis as a supplement to their own endogenous endocannabinoids, I'm sure that we're going to start to discover other areas of health where supplementing the endocannabinoid system may be helpful. But right now, we're kind of focusing on things like migraines, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, some of those kinds of big diseases that can happen. One of the ways that Ethan Russo sort of said, hey, we should pay attention to this is in the research with some of these people that have those medical conditions that I just mentioned. They were supplementing them with cannabinoids from the cannabis plant. So in the same way that we might take vitamin B supplements or vitamin C supplements or vitamin D supplements because we're not getting enough sunshine to create enough vitamin D in the body. What has happened is that when people with these conditions are given supplemental cannabinoids, they actually improve, their health improves. So we have a whole lot more to learn about clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, but this really sets us up for curiosity to learn more about this. And it also helps to give a better understanding and better respect to the cannabis plant that will allow it to become more mainstream part of our medical system. So after we've kind of found the cannabinoid receptors, we found the endocannabinoids, and then this proposed condition of clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, we started making a whole lot more discoveries about how cannabinoids or the endocannabinoid system works in the body. And all of this is just really leading to a better understanding of this physiological system. We know that it affects all human physiology, and I think as we learn more, it's going to garner a lot more attention of both the scientific and the medical community that will really start to drive some bigger discoveries in the future. It's kind of interesting how we thought something that was really bad for us, being the cannabis plant that has been vilified for decades, going on a century, and we're now finding out how important this plant just might be to our ongoing health and wellness. So a few areas of research that we're going to be looking into is how genetics affect the functioning of the endocannabinoid system. So when the human genome was started to be sequenced out back in the 90s, that really opened the door for genetic testing. And there's lots of companies out there that are now doing genetic testing for you. And not only is it great, sort of fun to discover who your ancestors are, who you're actually related to, and because we can tell that genetically, but what it's also doing is it's helping us to understand why people react differently to different foods, to different medicines, to different plant medicine, to different environments, those kinds of things, because there's a genetic factor in all of that. So genetics is going to become more and more part of our healthcare system. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, there would be a choice to just have your child genetically tested when they're born. Sounds a little dystopian, but it may actually provide better health care in the future. So we really have to be willing to be open to that possibility while still guarding against that our genetics being used in some sort of discriminatory manner against us if we happen to have some sort of a health issue going forward. But genetics really is going to play a role, and we're starting to understand through genetic testing how the endocannabinoid system works and why people respond differently to a substance like cannabis, especially the THC component of cannabis, which can cause psychoactivity in people, and for other people they can use the same amount and they don't get any psychoactivity at all. So it's curious and it's interesting to see where this is going to lead us to. We're also a lot of research going into the role of the endocannabinoid system in the development of cancer. Why do people in the same condition, maybe even from the same family that have had the same environmental conditions, ate the same food, one develops cancer and another one doesn't? So genetics may have a role to play in that, but we also may be able to understand how cannabinoid medicine can help to overcome some of the sort of genetic weaknesses that some people have and that causes them to have poor health throughout their life. So studies in these areas are ongoing. I find it a super fascinating area to look at. There's already starting to be like big university courses that are maybe starting to touch on the endocannabinoid system, but there definitely will be whole degrees in the endocannabinoid system as a part of medicine in the future.